Longtime subscribers of mine may feel as though something is off. Dom is reviewing Resident Evil 7. I thought he hated that game and wouldn't even buy it. Both of those are true, however it seems as though many people have forgotten that I mentioned once on Twitter that I was gifted the game by my friend Singh on Steam during the holiday season of 2019. The base game was also free on PlayStation Plus via the PS Plus collection on PlayStation 5. Also in this regard, I should mention that in the IAS Discord server, a group that I help host podcasts for as well as moderate server activity, I did mention on a number of different occasions that if I was gifted the game, I would only play it under those circumstances and I would subsequently review it. Otherwise, I still stand on my personal bias of not giving Capcom a single cent for this game because I personally believe that it is not a quality game and it's not of the quality that I would come to expect from this franchise after the success of the Revelation series. Now that said, I know that some of you will heavily disagree with my opinions on the game and may feel as though that this was the perfect direction for Capcom to take with Resident Evil 7 and it was in your particular liking. I think that's perfectly fine and perfectly reasonable so long as there is an understanding that not everyone will share the same opinions on something that you may like or dislike. So simply put, please, whether it be myself or somebody else that happens to review the game or share their opinions on the game, whether they dislike the game or like the game, take it as a simple difference of opinion. There's one last thing that I need to discuss before fully getting into the review, and that is my time spent at Capcom a few years ago where I was able to play test Resident Evil 7 before launch. So the story goes back sometime after the announcement for the game. Capcom had officially launched their Resident Evil Ambassador program, to which, despite feeling disappointed by what I saw of Resident Evil 7, I did still sign up in the hopes of seeing some news on Resident Evil 2 Remake at the time. I had just played the beginning hour demo, still feeling very disappointed and feeling as though it was very much a cash grab at the typical run and hide sims that came before it, such as Outlast and Amnesia. At the time, I was a 19-year-old kid who had just gotten a new job by sheer luck, and I had no idea that I would be lucky enough to receive an email 2 weeks into my new job from Capcom of all companies. The email that I received talked about how I had won a trip to San Francisco, California to visit Capcom and have the chance to experience the start of the Resident Evil 7 Biohazard demo tour. The tour was going to feature the Lantern demo, which had a reveal trailer the night before we had the chance to play it. I say we because I was invited alongside 6 other people who also received the same email. In regards to the email, it made mention that those invited would be given the very special opportunity of visiting at the time the very recently moved into Capcom USA HQ that was located in San Francisco. Believe me when I say it was recently moved into, they'd literally just moved into the building and still had moving boxes all over the place. In the offices, we would be given the very special permission under a non-disclosure agreement or NDA to play an exclusive preview build of the game where we would give direct feedback to the developers. From what I can say now, since the NDA agreement was only ever valid up until the game's release, the demos, including what I played behind closed doors, were very much representative of the full product despite Capcom saying otherwise. Things may have been fine-tuned and adjusted for the full release, which at this point have been patched and adjusted even more so, but otherwise it was relatively the same. The only notable thing that I can tell you is that there was a hard mode at one point, which I did play through and supposedly was one of the fastest people to complete the demo, despite taking my time and looking through RE Engine's various details at the time. It's also very likely that hard mode's balancing was dropped down to normal and the true hard mode of the game was renamed to Madhouse difficulty. There's one very last important detail before we get into the actual review that I need to disclose. Capcom fully paid for my flight and hotel expenses on top of giving me a free ride with Uber. So any potential bias towards or against the game, as well as towards Capcom itself, is something that I wanted to fully disclose when going into this review. With all of that covered, I think it's time we find out whether or not Resident Evil 7 Biohazard is worth picking up. Resident Evil 7 follows our main protagonist, Ethan Winters, who receives a message from his wife who's thought to have been deceased for about 3 years. Ethan, upon receiving this message, decides to travel to Louisiana to find his wife, but upon arriving, things take a very slow turn for the worst possible scenario for Ethan to be in. Not only is his wife alive, but it seems that she, alongside a southern family, the Bakers, are infected with some sort of weaponized mold that is known as the E-type, which causes them to go violent and insane within seconds. With the help of the only only other survivor, Zoe Baker, Ethan must find his wife, the cure for the E-type mold, and a way to escape the Baker plantation house. That's the general summary of what this story is about. I really didn't enjoy this game's story because I personally felt like it was a watered down version of Silent Hill 2's story. Now, I'm not saying that developers can't take inspiration from other stories, whether that be from video games or other forms of media, but it's odd to me how people act as if this is an original story that isn't flawed in any way, shape, or form. The reason why Silent Hill 2 works as a story is because it's written with well acted out characters, making that world feel believable. Resident Evil 7, on the other hand, fails at this in my opinion because the Bakers are acted out in a way that makes you laugh during points where you should be taking the game seriously. And sure, I know that the counterpoint will likely be something along the lines of, well, Resident Evil is a silly franchise, so this shouldn't really come as any sort of surprise or disappointment. While that is true, Capcom specifically wanted to go for a more realistic feeling game with 7. I actually think it's kind of odd how the games that have been deemed unrealistic feel more believable to me. Take Jack Baker for instance. He's supposed to be this very intimidating pursuer, very akin to the tyrant seen in previous entries. The problem comes in when he starts talking in all of his encounters during the main game. I see people often saying that Jack is the equivalent to the original Mr. X and Nemesis, but I just don't see it in that way. In my opinion, the reason why Mr. X feels more realistic is because he's supposed to be this intimidating tyrant that you as the player would be familiar with based on your experiences of the first game. Even if you didn't play Resident Evil 1 prior, rather than talking to really get the point across that this thing meant business, all it really had to do was burst through a wall or show up on screen with the music playing at just the right moment to indicate that things just got serious. Nemesis works well because it takes everything that worked with Mr. X and ramps it up to 11. The other thing too is that while Nemesis does speak, the only thing it's able to say is stars whilst roaring. Aside from that, Nemesis can practically outrun Jill, whereas Jack just does a power walk towards Ethan. It's these subtle touches in the way that threats were introduced in those games that make them far more compelling and realistic compared to Jack. I know fear is supposed to be a very subjective thing, but I just couldn't find myself to truly be scared of a character I was generally laughing about. I'd be lying if I said I never got startled while playing RE7, but the reason being wasn't because I was afraid of Jack or any of the other BOWs. Most of the time if I was getting startled, it was because I wasn't paying attention, and most of the time when I was playing the game, I was having a full-on conversation, so it was very easy to get me startled just because I wasn't paying attention. That's not to say that others can't find Jack or anything else about this game scary, it's just that I didn't really feel what others were feeling based on how these characters were portrayed. And speaking of character portrayal, I really couldn't buy Lucas as an antagonist either. Not specifically the fact that he's an actual child murderer, but more so that he'd partner up with a shady organization for the purposes of understanding how viable the mold is as a bioweapon. Like, what rhyme or reason does he have to really do so? It's not like characters from previous entries who were doing similar things simply for monetary gain or to gain power. By that I mean it wasn't like he had an ultimate goal in mind such as other characters in the series when doing things in a similar fashion. Since I'm on the subject of antagonists, you may notice that I haven't really said much about Marguerite. The character suffers from the same problem as Jack where they talk way too much, but to be totally honest, I didn't really find myself that much annoyed by her. Actually, I've kind of found myself digging the idea of some crazy old lady with a lantern who could control insects as their gimmick. I think the problem here that I have is that it was a very short-lived gimmick and the actual boss fight was very underwhelming. I'll talk a little bit more about that boss fight when we get into the gameplay side of things. There's also Evelyn, who I feel is more or less written as well as a villain from a poorly made Nickelodeon sitcom. I mean, seriously, you mean to tell me this character is supposed to be as interesting and intimidating as antagonists from previous entries? I think if this character was an actual adult rather than a rapidly aging child, I could sympathize with them and feel more intimidated by them. To me, it seems they wanted to have a child character that more or less was toying with everyone but not fully aware of what they were capable of in terms of their powers. An adult character could have toyed with each one of these characters within the story, but done so in a way where they were trying to get a full understanding of what they were capable of. I'm not saying that it couldn't have been done with a child character, but what I am saying is that it wasn't done well in my opinion. Instead, we're left with this.
Then I don't need you anymore.
Antagonists aside, how do I feel about the other characters? Well, I feel like they were really bland and practically forgettable. Seriously, I can't remember a scene or a piece of dialogue that really stood out to me or felt like a defining moment for the series. It's not like past entries where I haven't played certain games in years, but can remember vividly how a scene went down with the character's dialogue. For example, my problem with Ethan is that it just sounds like he doesn't really care about what's going on. Even when we get to the hallucination scene where Jack is able to telepathically talk to him as his normal self. which, by the way, I really dislike that scene simply on the premise that it doesn't fit with what Resident Evil is supposed to be about. I just couldn't find Ethan to be a likable or relatable protagonist in any way. I brought up Silent Hill 2 earlier, and just to bring it up again, it's as if Ethan is more or less a discount James Sunderland. Then there's Mia, which honestly I didn't care for much either. My issue with Mia is that she's almost as blind as Ethan, although as a positive note I do think that her reactions of being scared in the situation that she's in is far more believable compared to Ethan's, but that's not saying much. Honestly, when I was going throughout the story, it kind of felt like the game was originally meant to star her as the main protagonist, given her role later on in the story. After all, the story kicks off with her and even goes as far as to show us flashbacks explaining how things got the way they were by the time Ethan arrives several years later. It just feels like they wrote a story specifically for Mia, but then midway through development they said, scrap that idea, we're gonna make her average Joe husband the main protagonist so we can tell everybody that he's relatable to the player, without really thinking about if that was the best approach to the game's narrative. Then again, I'm not sure if scrapping Ethan would have made the game better in my eyes. I think my main problem with all of these characters is that none of them are memorable, nor do they have any memorable lines. I'm not saying this game had to be cheesy like the games that preceded it, but it would have been preferable to have some strong character defining moments, which this game strongly lacks. There's no real chemistry between the characters either. For example, Zoe calls Ethan throughout the game, but they only meet near the end of the game. And then suddenly I'm supposed to believe that their interactions led to a mutual friendship of sorts when I chose to cure Mia over Zoe. They try to build this up like it was some kind of betrayal, but it doesn't make any sense for Zoe to get mad when they barely knew each other. Plus, it's more logical to think that Ethan would save his wife first. Then again, alternatively, if you save Zoe, Mia gets mad without taking into consideration that she's been missing for 3 years and also tried to unwillingly kill Ethan. I just don't understand how this is good storytelling. The only thing that I found memorable was the fact that the character swore quite a bit, which is funny because I recall people heavily criticizing the remakes of Resident Evils 2 and 3, but didn't really talk about it with this game. Anyway, I don't mean to go on this whole tangent, so to wrap things up, I just really didn't enjoy the story for this game. I felt it was just not memorable, nor were there redeeming qualities to it in my opinion. I had this game's story explained to me as something you have to just take in from moment to moment, rather than thinking about it for more than a few minutes. Honestly, that's more of a me issue since I can't help but think about how flawed this story is in my opinion. I'm not saying that others can't enjoy this story, I'm just saying this is why I couldn't enjoy it. I think I've talked enough about the story and the characters, so let's get into the soundtrack of Resident Evil 7. RE7's approach to music is interesting to say the least. The game has a really subtle soundtrack, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad soundtrack, it's just too subtle. In fact, while I've been writing the script for this review, I've been listening to an hour-long version of the save room music, which honestly I found to be quite relaxing. The only other thing that I will critique about this game's soundtrack is that Capcom claimed to have been going back to roots with 7. Well, I don't really feel like that was accomplished with the soundtrack either. With a statement like we're going back to roots in terms of a soundtrack, it makes me think that there should have been more rooms where the soundtrack is noticeable instead of having dead silence. Not to say that there weren't times in previous entries that had rooms with no music. However, when that music was present, it wasn't like it wasn't noticeable at all. So really, I have no real complaints about the soundtrack itself, other than it being too subtle and just not memorable. Honestly, the Resident Evil 1 Director's Cut DualShock version has more memorable tracks, and I'm willing to die on that hill. Anyway, let's talk about the gameplay of Resident Evil 7. The gameplay for Resident Evil 7 is meant to scale the series back into the survival horror gameplay style of the classic games that preceded it. This led to the developers at Capcom to hail this game as a return to roots for the series after they received negative reception for Resident Evil 6, which was an action-heavy departure for the series. Which, to be fair, I will give Capcom some credit here in that Resident Evil is supposed to be a survival horror franchise and not a third-person shooter. So in that regard, I can completely understand and agree with that perspective of wanting to change the series back to what it started as. However, where my issue lies is that the developers claimed this game was a return to roots, which it really isn't. To explain what I mean, oftentimes I see people in the community share an image from Resident Evil 1's concept builds where it was at one point going to be a horror-themed first-person shooter. As a result, people argue that because of this, it means that Resident Evil 7 was clearly going back to roots by being in first person. but I don't agree with that notion. I can agree they went and revitalized the cut gameplay concepts. Honestly, Capcom does it all the time with this series, but to say that it's going back to roots I think is just incorrect. I'm not saying that they had to make this game a fixed camera angled experience, but I don't think that it really went back to roots for reviving some cut concepts. I mean, by this logic, Resident Evil 6 was also going back to roots for having zombies. To be fair, this game did go back to horror, I just don't feel it truly went back to roots like the developers claimed it has. But enough about roots. How does the actual gameplay fare compared to previous entries? Well, the best way that I think I can describe it is that Capcom attempted to recreate the playstyle and mechanics of the old games. Your inventory is limited to a few slots, but as you progress through the game, you'll find backpacks to increase your inventory size. The inventory menu itself is very simplistic and is somewhat of a hybrid of classic RE inventories and some of the more recent entries that came after those classics in terms of how it works. So when accessing your inventory, you're not safe at all and you need to be mindful of when you open it up. While you won't be in many situations where you'll need to go through the inventory in the middle of combat, players should be aware of this, especially when going up against the very few bosses of this entry. Resident Evil 7 also brings in a new way to craft health items as well as enhanced ammo. But before I get into the enhanced ammo, let me discuss how healing items work. So now you only have the green herb in this game, unlike previous entries which also featured a red herb, a blue herb, and in the case of Resident Evil 4, a yellow herb. However, in this game, the alternative herb types have been replaced by the yellow and red chemical mixing agents. These essentially act like combining herbs in past games, but are slightly different. In 7, healing with a single green herb barely heals you, which I thought was a bit odd in terms of balancing, because in past games, while the green herb was supposed to be the bare minimum of what you could heal with, it was never so minimal to the point where it felt like it was useless on its own. So you, who may not have played 7 prior, might think, oh well, that's not a big deal, I'll just combine 2 or 3 herbs and make the most out of my healing items. But you can't do that. Combining an herb with other green herbs is just not possible in this game, so you're forced to use yellow or red chemical mixing agents instead. Now you might think that this isn't a big deal, but from my perspective, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to change a mechanic that for the most part has been consistent in the mainline series. To be fair, this technically isn't the only RE game to change how the healing mechanic works, but I like consistency. Anyway, to maximize the potential of healing items, you'll probably be sticking with yellow chem fluid in terms of combinations. This acts like a mixture of 2 green herbs like in past games. However, this also gives you the added benefit of having a dedicated heal button. To be totally honest, I don't really know how I feel about this. I think it's fine that there is a heal button, I just don't understand why the unmixed herbs also don't have this function as well. You actually have to go through the inventory to heal with those instead. Then there's also the combination of a green herb with the red chem fluid. This is more or less a first aid spray, triple green herb mixture, or a green and red mixture from past games. You'll still be able to use the heal button, and the game, from what I can tell, will prioritize your weaker healing items, which is a good thing if you're trying to save up on those stronger healing items for later. That being said, I just don't understand why they couldn't have kept the old mechanics from previous games. I'm not saying that they couldn't have changed it, but I just don't understand why they felt it necessary in this case. Part of me feels as though it was done to show off the texture details with the new RE engine, since it's more graphically intensive compared to Capcom's MT framework. However, another part of me feels as though it might be because they wanted to show off those healing animations for people playing with the PlayStation VR headset. Whatever the case may be, I'll just say that I'm a bit confused by the decision to change mechanics that really didn't need to be changed. And speaking of mechanics, I said I was going to talk about the enhanced ammo. So in 7, we see the return of enhanced ammo, however it's only limited to handguns, which is rather unfortunate. In my opinion, this is one of the few good things I can praise from this game. You can craft regular handgun ammo using the yellow chem fluid, and then enhanced handgun ammo using the red chem fluid. Throughout the game, you'll be saving the red chem fluid mostly for crafting enhanced ammo. Using this ammo will generally inflict high to critical damage against the molded end bosses at the cost of higher recoil, though it's really not that significant. Aside from crafting enhanced ammo, you can also craft 2 types of grenade rounds as well as flamethrower fuel. These can be crafted with the chem fluid with either solid fuel or supplements. Oddly, there's no way to craft magnum rounds, shotgun shells, or submachine gun rounds, and I'm not sure if this was done intentionally because of the amount of ammo you can get by the end of the game, or if it was something that the developers just weren't thinking about at the time. The last 2 things I'd like to point out with crafting is that you can make psychostimulants, and you can also uncraft certain items items to get additional chem fluid. With psychostimulants, they increase your FOV whilst also giving you the ability to see all obtainable items near your general location. This is to compensate for the lack of item glint that was present in previous games but removed in this game. However, psychostimulants also have the added benefit of being able to see items behind walls. You won't know what they are, you'll just know that they're in those places. Also, under very specific circumstances, you can unlock the X-ray glasses, which replicate this effect without the FOV being adjusted so long as it's in your inventory. Then there's the uncrafting mechanic. You're able to uncraft certain items with the blue chem fluid. I actually really liked this idea because I thought it was a very good addition, and it wasn't something that we had the ability to do in previous games, so the option being there was very nice in my opinion. The problem I have with it though is that it's not something that you can do often, not to mention that you only ever find about 3 or 4 of the blue chem fluid packs in the entire game. This is a mechanic that's also very limited to what you can use it on, such as combined herbs, handgun ammo, grenade rounds, or burner fuel. Once again, shotgun shells, magnum rounds, and SMG rounds are not able to combine with this item. With that in mind, this is a really useful feature if you need to make your healing items stronger, or perhaps need to craft a bit of ammo if you're running low. I found myself really utilizing this feature in my run of Madhouse difficulty, where resources were more scarce. Combining blue chem fluid with an item will result in either gaining yellow or red chem fluid based on what item is used. So for example, a strong healing liquid mixed with blue chem fluid would result in gaining red chem fluid. Anyway, that's essentially everything you need to know about crafting, so with that out of the way, let's talk about the combat of Resident Evil 7. With the shift to first person, you would think this would make things easier, and this is partially true, especially if you're someone like me who plays first person shooters on a regular basis. Often landing a headshot isn't really that hard to do in this game. However, what can make it difficult, especially for those unfamiliar with first person games, is that the molded tend to sway their heads back and forth as they move. This of course will vary though, as some molded will appear already missing limbs, or in the case of one variation, they'll act a little bit more like lickers in a sense. What genuinely confuses me is that despite this game being in first person, you never really aim down sights, at least not in the main game, despite the shadows clearly indicating that Ethan clearly knows how to do so. Look, for a game that tries to pride itself on having a more realistic tone, I just refuse to believe that at no point Ethan never thought to himself to just look down the iron sights for the various guns that he uses. Since we're on the topic of weapons, there's a small number of weapons to be found in this game, and each varies in terms of their overall performance, but I would say this is actually one of the few strong points of this game that I could praise. Although there is one small issue that I personally had, and that was with the SMG that was featured in this game. Now, I don't personally have a problem with it being there, but I personally found it odd that a Russian PP-19 Bison would be featured in a game that's set in America that's being used by a shady organization that's similar to Umbrella. I know, it's a nitpick, but to me it would have made more sense to have an SMG that's used primarily in America, especially since they were transporting illegal cargo and trying not to get caught by organizations such as the BSAA in the story. Just thought I'd point that out. And one last thing on this tangent that I'd like to get out of the way, since I did really notice this in RE Engine, since a lot of the details are good in this engine, but I find it strange how the gun's rear sights are missing a hole or cutout to properly aim down sights. If the developers were pushing for realism, this was obviously an oversight. Okay, I promise I'll stop talking about this. For now. Anyway, the last thing that I want to discuss is the enemies. Now, we've already talked about the bakers themselves, but just as a brief overview for the people that skipped the story synopsis, it essentially boils down to 2 of the 5 bakers that are a threat to the player. For about half of the game, they will act as sort of pursuers to their set-piece locations. Jack in particular won't really mutate in the first 2 encounters of the game. His initial form will have you needing to keep your distance as he power walks towards you with heavily modified maintenance tools to attack you with. After your second boss fight with him, he'll eventually mutate into this giant blob with eyes, and while Capcom seemingly wants to stray away from RE4 style bosses, I guess they decided to make an exception here since all you have to do is shoot out his eyes. That said, at least it was more engaging than his other 2 boss fights. Marguerite is similar in that she will walk around the abandoned guest house, but unlike Jack, she walks very slowly around the area and has insects that she controls to do most of her attacks. This will change, however, when you actually get to her boss fight after she's mutated. While the idea of her as an enemy or boss really grew on me, the boss fight itself was something that I was very underwhelmed by, mainly being that she's just an over-glorified molded that acts like a mix of the standard and crawler type molded. The only thing that sticks out to me is that she releases insects from her legs on occasion as a form of attack. The standard enemy types are the molded, and these will be the enemies you'll have general encounters with. The molded are not varied in terms of their overall design, and there's only really about 4 types in the entirety of the main game. The only other type of enemy are these strange looking insect enemies that honestly were the only things that kind of felt refreshing to see, since they were the only different type of enemy that wasn't the molded. They had some form of different design that stood out that made it feel refreshing. I mean, for a game that claims that it's going back to roots, they sure did a good job of not replicating the enemy variety from past games. I can understand wanting to move away from things like zombies, ganados, Magini, Huavo, and etc. for something new, but you want to know what all of those enemies had in common? All of them had various designs, and in later examples they had various mutations that could occur in-game. The molded all look the same even with their variations. They're just really boring and uninspired looking enemies. It's odd because apparently in the concept art for 7 there was at one point going to be zombie variants of the molded, which I think could have helped with the variety to some degree. I'm not really sure how you can make such a bold claim of going back to roots but then not follow up with that when it comes to the enemy variety. Ultimately, I think that the enemies are just not only lackluster but extremely forgettable due to their samey look with the overall variations. That's all I really have to say for the gameplay, and normally I would give my overall thoughts, but it's time that we move on to the DLC of the game. Resident Evil 7 features a handful of DLC. I won't be discussing all of it as a majority of it is just minigames. However, I will be focusing on the 3 DLC chapters, Daughters, End of Zoe, and Not a Hero. The reason being is that these are really the only additional DLCs that feature story content and changes to the gameplay to some slight degree. I'll leave timestamps on screen for people who want to skip the story spoilers and get straight into the gameplay. Let's start with the Daughters DLC. In Daughters, you take control of Zoe Baker during the Night of the Storm, in which Jack and Lucas Baker go out and rescue Mia and Evelyn, unknowingly bringing in a dangerous BOW into their home. This is a really short DLC chapter that can honestly be beaten within a few minutes. The only thing that you really get out of it is the bad ending or the canon ending, which leads into the main game. The Daughters DLC chapter has absolutely no means of defending yourself, so it literally makes the game become a typical run and hide simulator, or at the very least a running simulator, since you can complete this so fast. I really don't care for first person run and hide simulators, and this is what I was concerned that the main game would essentially become, since it seemed to me as though Capcom tried to jump on a really popular trend at the time rather than setting one like they have with past entries in the series. All I can really say is that at least the majority of the game does feature some form of combat. If you thought that the main game was very sparse in terms of enemy variety, then this DLC is even worse since you only really deal with Jack. It's honestly really boring, and I would not recommend wasting your time with this DLC. Instead, just watch somebody play it on YouTube. You'd get the same exact experience at this point. Next up, we have the End of Zoe DLC chapter. Before I get into talking about this story and gameplay of this particular DLC, can I just say that if you hope Capcom shelves Chris or Leon in the future, Joe Baker basically instills this notion that we'll probably be seeing those two in future REs when they're in their 70s and 80s. Anyways, jokes aside, the End of Zoe DLC takes place after the main game and features a new character, Joe Baker, brother to Jack and uncle to Zoe and Lucas. Joe is trying to find out what happened to Zoe and how he could find a cure for her before she could potentially die from the mold or fully turn into a BOW. He needs to get through the security checkpoints that Blue Umbrella set up via paths within the nearby swamp in the area to find that cure that they have and to prevent Jack, whom we thought was killed in the main story, from causing more damage. I know a lot of people really enjoyed this DLC, but I thought it was just okay compared to the main game. It wasn't really anything special to me. I do think that what makes this DLC stand out, at least from a story perspective, is that at least Joe has a personality compared to the cast of the main game. In terms of gameplay, End of Zoe is unique in that your combat is primarily done with your fist, but you also have access to spears for projectiles as well as custom-made mines. Joe has the advantage of stealth takedowns, which got me really thinking, why the hell hasn't Capcom tried to make a boxing game as well as a stealth game? Honestly, these ideas are good, I just kind of wish that Capcom would dabble in something new instead of forcing them into Resident Evil titles. Enemy variety is not that much different from the main game, but you will be fighting alligators, which is nice to see by comparison to the majority of the returning molded from the main game, as well as the one new molded variant that just gets additional spikes on its body. It doesn't fix the issue of the lack of enemy variety from the main game, but it is one more enemy type as well as one new molded variant that we don't see in the main game. There is also one boss fight that you happen to fight twice, and one of those fights involves a power glove. End of Zoe also slightly changes the way that the healing mechanic works from the main game. For the most part, it works the same as the main game, but you also have the addition of grub, which ranges from various insects to crawfish that you can find throughout the DLC. It's an interesting change, and I think it fits very well with a character like Joe, who is more or less a survivalist. The End of Zoe DLC is short, but is significantly longer than the Daughters DLC. So even if you were just trying to speedrun through this one, you won't be completing it as quickly as the Daughters DLC. Lastly, there is the Not a Hero DLC featuring returning protagonist Chris Redfield. Not a Hero is a bit strange in that it contradicts the developer statements about 7 in that it's a more action-focused DLC. In Not a Hero, the story follows Chris after the events of the main game, who's on the hunt for Lucas Baker. This DLC is more or less straightforward, though it does give a little bit more insight on Blue Umbrella, as well as the new organization known as the Connections through notes and small bits of dialogue. The gameplay is mostly the same as the main game, but there are a few notable changes. For starters, you can actually aim down sights with your gun, and you would think that this would make the game slightly easier because of this function, but I would argue that it varies. Due to how the enemies tend to sway back and forth, sometimes placing a well-made headshot can be a little bit more difficult than it seems. That being said, it is a very nice feature to have and feels way more realistic as opposed to the aiming from the main game. Health items have also been reworked for this DLC. You no longer have chem fluid to combine herbs with, and instead you'll find syringes that will fully heal you. It's because of this that these tend to be more scarce than the healing items found in the main game as well as in the End of Zoe DLC. At the very least, there's also steroids and stimulants that you can find throughout the DLC to upgrade Chris's overall health. Chris is also able to punch and stomp on enemies if they're stunned. You'll find that this feature is pretty useful in tight situations where there may be multiple enemies to deal with. The punch is especially a good way to give yourself some distance to any molded that may have come in a little too close for comfort. There's also one last new feature of this DLC, and that is the new ammo type. Not a Hero gets rid of the enhanced ammo in favor of a new ammo type called the anti-regen ammo or ramrods. These are used to dispose of a new white molded type that can withstand normal bullets, but be warned that these are very few in numbers, so you'll be hoarding these for very specific enemies. And speaking of enemies, let's get into the new enemy type as well as the two bosses. Not a Hero also lacks the enemy variety that we would come to expect from a Resident Evil game. However, just like the previous DLC, it does add in something new, even though it does look too similar to the main molded enemy types in the main game. The Fumers, which is a new molded variant that's white, has regenerative powers and secretes fumes. These can only be killed with the ramrod rounds that I discussed earlier. Again, these aren't too different from the basic molded, however they do behave differently in gameplay compared to the standard enemies. I think these were a decent introduction because you couldn't just engage them in the same way that you would everything else in this game. Next up we have one of the two bosses, Mama Mold. Yeah, I wish I was making that one up. Anyway, this boss is exclusive to this DLC, but more or less feels like a reskin of the Fat Molded that has different properties compared to that Fat Molded in the main game. It's lackluster because it doesn't feel new or different enough from what was already in the main game, so I don't know why it was even added to begin with. And then lastly, we have Lucas Baker. More or less, he's kind of in the same boat as the Mama Mold boss fight. He feels very similar to what's already established in the game with Jack in the End of Zoe DLC, but with the main difference being is that he can secrete gas during that boss fight. I will say that what was interesting is that you did have to maintain your oxygen levels, so that was a cool idea, but the boss fight itself isn't really that much different from what was already in the main game as well as the DLC. Other than that, this is all you really have to know about the 3 DLC pieces. They all varied in quality, and some of them introduced some really interesting ideas and even tried to add to the lackluster enemy variety, but is any of this DLC worth buying? Well, before I answer that question, let me give my overall thoughts and discuss whether or not I think Resident Evil 7 is worth picking up. Resident Evil 7 is a game that Capcom proclaimed as a game that is a return to roots for the franchise by scaling back the action seen in more recent Resident Evil titles such as 5, 6, and Operation Raccoon City. However, in my eyes, it really didn't do that. As a game, it does scale back things to the horror genre, but not as a traditional Resident Evil game. I don't think that having fixed camera angles or an over-the-shoulder perspective really would have changed that about this game. I do think, however, that this game is more or less a cut concept that has been revitalized. 7 just lacks the atmosphere and charm of the best titles within the series, in my opinion. The music is just too subtle for my taste, and while I don't think it was necessarily bad, it was just way too subtle for me to feel like it was truly a return to roots like the developers claimed it has from that perspective as well. The story just felt very uninteresting to me, and I generally disliked a majority of the characters, with the exception of Joe, who I think, unlike the rest of the cast, had a likable personality in comparison to the rest of the cast. At best, we get characters like Joe Baker, and at worst, we get characters like Evie. Gameplay was a mixed bag for me across the board, as some aspects could work well if expanded upon, while others I just really didn't care for or just didn't like. Aspects of the game does have a similar feel to older Resident Evil titles, but not entirely in the same vein as them. The DLC does shake a few things up by changing up some of the mechanics and adding in additional enemies. I gave the game a fair shake and even went out of my way to get the Platinum Trophy on PS4, but in the end I just couldn't find myself enjoying this game. More often than not, I was just bored playing it and wanted to do anything else but play this game. However, I did want to live up to my word and review it, since I did tell people that if I was given this game, I would review it. And now that I have, I've essentially earned the right to say that I don't think that this game is worth picking up. Please keep in mind that if you liked this game or found some enjoyment out of it, I'm not trying to take that away from you. I'm just simply trying to share an opinion and give people a different point of view that is negative. If you like the game, that's great. I just didn't think it was good as a Resident Evil game. That being said, for someone who still might be interested in trying out the game, what would I recommend they do? Well, at launch, the game was obviously $60, but has since gone down in price. The game is currently averaging at about $25 for both the base version and the gold edition. There's really no need to purchase the base edition, since you would have to pay an additional $40 for the DLC individually, or $30 if you want to purchase the season pass. Not a Hero is the only free DLC, however, be aware that you still have to download it even with the gold edition, which I thought was a bit odd. Even if you have the physical edition, that you still have to download it. Anyway, I think it's best that you actually get this game with the current bundle it has with Resident Evil Village Digital Deluxe Edition, which costs about $80, or at least it did at launch. You get 2 games, DLC for Village, as well as some other digital goods. And I should also note too that it includes the gold edition of Resident Evil 7. This to me would be the best way to get the game, because I do not feel that 7 is worth more than $10. However, you may feel otherwise. Anyway, I really should stop talking about this game and stop taking detours and talking about other Resident Evil games and get back to that small Midwestern town we're all so familiar with. But until then, I'll see you all in the next one. Matane.